The blood-red sunset painted the sky as Eleanor Jones rode into Blackwater Creek, her hands trembling against the reins. 3 days ago she had been a schoolteacher with dreams of independence. Now she was merchandise, being delivered to settle her brother's gambling debt. Wyoming Territory, 1878. The town of Blackwater Creek sprawled across the dusty landscape like a weathered scar. Eleanor's brother Robert had fled in the night, leaving behind nothing but a crumpled note. "Forgive me, Ellie. I had no choice." And a contract bearing her signature forged by her own flesh and blood. The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of the Silver Dollar Saloon. Eleanor clutched her small carpetbag, the only possession she'd managed to bring from her home in St. Louis. The journey west had been brutal, each mile putting greater distance between her and everything she'd ever known. "Out," barked the driver, a man who had barely spoken 10 words during their 3-day journey. "They're expecting you inside." Eleanor stepped down, her navy traveling dress coated with dust. At 22, she had never imagined such a fate. She'd been teaching mathematics to young ladies, saving for a home of her own. Now she was property, sold to cover Robert's $500 debt to whoever waited inside. The saloon doors swung open. A tall man with a silver-streaked beard emerged, his eyes cold as he assessed her. "Miss Jones," he said, his voice like gravel, "Bradford Pike, your brother owes me a considerable sum." Eleanor stood straight despite her exhaustion. "There must be some mistake. I never agreed to this arrangement." Pike's laugh held no humor. "Your signature suggests otherwise." He produced the contract Robert had forged. "You're mine now. I paid good money for you." Eleanor's voice barely rose above a whisper. "And what exactly am I to do for you, Mr. Pike?" "Work off the debt. My establishment needs women." His eyes traveled over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Pretty ones especially." Before Eleanor could respond, a deep voice cut through the evening air. "How much?" A tall figure stepped from the shadows of the hitching post. Broad-shouldered and lean-hipped, he moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to danger. His Stetson was pulled low, but Eleanor could see a strong jaw dusted with stubble and piercing blue eyes that assessed the situation with calm intensity. "This ain't your business, Ryder," Pike spat. The man Ryder stepped closer. The fading sunlight revealed weathered skin and a small scar that cut through his right eyebrow. He couldn't be more than 30, Eleanor guessed, though his eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen far more than his years suggested. "I'm making it my business," Ryder replied evenly. "How much for the lady's contract?" Pike's eyes narrowed. "More than you can afford, Cowboy, $500 plus interest." "I'll pay it," Ryder said, "with my hands." A tense silence followed. Eleanor glanced between the two men, confusion mixing with the faintest flicker of hope. "Your hands," Pike finally responded with derision. "My labor," Ryder clarified. "I'll work it off. That new ranch of yours needs building. I'm good with wood and stone, and I can break horses better than any man in the territory." Pike seemed to consider this, eyeing Ryder with suspicion. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" Ryder's gaze flicked briefly to Eleanor. "No decent woman should be traded like cattle. I'll work off her debt and then she goes free." Eleanor found her voice. "I don't need your charity, sir." Ryder's eyes met hers. "It's not charity, madam, it's decency." Pike laughed, a harsh sound that scraped against the evening air. "You always were a fool, Ryder Reynolds. Fine, you want to break your back for some woman you don't know, her debt is yours. But you'll work at my ranch until every penny is paid, and if you run off, I'll hunt you down like the dog you are." Ryder nodded once, his expression unchanging. "Draw up the papers." As Pike retreated into the saloon, Eleanor approached her unexpected savior. "Mr. Reynolds, you don't understand what you're doing. My brother's debt isn't yours to pay," he finished, "and now it's not your concern. Why would you do this for a complete stranger?" Something dark flickered across his features. "Let's just say I know what it's like to be owned by someone else. No one deserves that fate." Before she could respond, Pike returned with papers in hand. "Sign," he commanded, thrusting a pen at Ryder. As Ryder signed, Pike turned to Eleanor with a sneer. "Looks like it's your lucky day, Miss Jones, but remember this Blackwater Creek is my town. Cross me and you'll regret it." "The lady won't be staying in your town," Ryder said, handing back the signed contract. "She'll be coming with me." Eleanor's head snapped up. "I beg your pardon." "My cabin's a day's ride from here," Ryder explained. "You can stay there while I work at Pike's ranch. It's not much, but it's safe." "And why should I trust you any more than him?" Eleanor demanded. A ghost of a smile crossed Ryder's lips. "Fair question. But I reckon if I wanted to take advantage, I wouldn't be signing up for months of hard labor." Pike folded the contract with a smirk. "Be at my ranch at sunrise, Reynolds. You've got a lot of work ahead of you." As Pike sauntered back into the saloon, Eleanor found herself alone with the stranger who had just purchased her freedom with his future labor. The sunset had deepened to purple, and the first stars pierced the darkening sky. "Mr. Reynolds, Ryder," he corrected. "Ryder," she repeated. "I can't accept this sacrifice. I'll find work in town, pay you back. Not in Pike's town, you won't," he cut in. "Not without falling into his hands anyway. Pike owns most businesses here. Besides, you didn't ask for this debt." Eleanor studied him, trying to discern his motives. "And what do you expect in return?" His expression softened slightly. "Nothing, Miss Jones. Contrary to what you might think of frontier men, some of us still believe in doing what's right." A cool evening breeze swept down the street, making Eleanor shiver in her travel-worn dress. Ryder noticed and removed his coat, offering it to her with a gesture that suggested he was unaccustomed to such gallantry. "Thank you," she murmured, slipping it around her shoulders. It carried the scent of leather, horses, and open air. "We should get supplies before the general store closes," Ryder said. "It's a long ride to my place." Eleanor hesitated. Everything in her education and upbringing warned against riding off into the wilderness with a stranger. Yet something about Ryder Reynolds' steady gaze conveyed trustworthiness that Pike's calculated charm had lacked. "Very well," she said finally. "But I want to be clear that I intend to repay this debt." Ryder nodded. "That's between you and your conscience, Miss Jones." "Now come on, I know the shopkeeper's daughter. She might have some clothes that would suit you better for trail riding." As they walked down the dusty main street, Eleanor clutched her carpetbag and tried to make sense of the last hour. Her brother had betrayed her, a stranger had saved her, and now she was headed into the unknown with a man who had just committed himself to months of servitude on her behalf. The Wyoming night settled around them like a heavy blanket, stars emerging in brilliant clusters overhead. Eleanor Jones, former mathematics teacher from St. Louis, took her first steps into a new and uncertain life in the untamed West, alongside a cowboy who had paid for her freedom with his hands. The general store's bell jingled as they entered. A plump woman with kind eyes looked up from behind the counter. "Ryder Reynolds," she greeted warmly. "Wasn't expecting to see you in town for another month." "Change of plans, Mrs. Holloway," he replied, removing his hat respectfully. "This is Miss Eleanor Jones. She needs some proper riding clothes and supplies." Mrs. Holloway's curious gaze swept over Eleanor. "Well now, don't you look like you've come a long way, dear. Come on back and we'll find something suitable. In the back room, Mrs." Holloway helped Eleanor select practical items. 2 sturdy skirts, several plain blouses, a warm jacket, sturdy boots, and undergarments. As Eleanor changed into one of the outfits, the shopkeeper chattered. "Ryder's a good man," she said quietly, helping Eleanor with the unfamiliar buttons of the riding skirt. "Keeps to himself mostly, but there's not a more honest soul in the territory. My Thomas was caught in that mine collapse 2 years back. Ryder was the one who dug through the night to get him out." Eleanor paused. "He seems different from other men I've encountered here." "That he is," Mrs. Holloway agreed. "Had a hard life, that one. Came west as a boy during the war. Never talks about it, but folks say he was orphaned young." When they emerged, Ryder was settling their bill, adding supplies like coffee, flour, and dried meat to their purchases. That'll be $18.40, Mrs. Holloway announced. Eleanor reached for her small purse, but Ryder had already placed the money on the counter. Add it to what I owe you, Eleanor insisted quietly. Ryder merely nodded, gathering their packages. Outside, he led her to the stables where his horse, a magnificent black gelding, waited alongside a sturdy bay mare he had just purchased. The mare's yours, he said, securing their supplies. She's gentle but sure-footed, can handle the mountain trails well enough. Eleanor approached the animal cautiously. I haven't ridden since I was a girl. She'll take care of you. Her name's Penny. Eleanor stroked the mare's velvet nose, receiving a soft nickering in response. Hello, Penny, she murmured, feeling an unexpected connection with the animal. As they prepared to mount up, a commotion erupted from the saloon. A man staggered out, clearly drunk, pointing in their direction. Reynolds, he shouted. Heard you're working for Pike now, becoming his lapdog. Ryder ignored him, continuing to adjust Eleanor's saddle. I'm talking to you. The man stumbled closer, revealing a weather-beaten face and bloodshot eyes. What's Pike got on you that you'd sign your life away, or is it for this pretty little thing? He leered at Eleanor. Mount up, Ryder instructed Eleanor quietly. We're leaving. But the drunk wasn't finished. Pike's been looking for a way to get you under his thumb for years. Guess he finally found it, he sneered, gesturing at Eleanor. Must be some woman to make the mighty Ryder Reynolds bow his head. In one fluid motion, Ryder stepped between Eleanor and the drunk. Go home, Jensen. You're making a fool of yourself. Jensen reached for his pistol, but his drunken fingers fumbled the draw. Before he could recover, Ryder had closed the distance between them. One quick movement and Jensen was on his knees, his arm twisted behind him, his gun in Ryder's hand. I said go home, Ryder repeated, his voice deadly calm. He ejected the bullets from Jensen's revolver before tossing it into the dirt beside the man. Next time you draw on someone, make sure you can follow through. He returned to Eleanor, who had watched the exchange with wide eyes. Sorry about that. Town's full of men with more whiskey than sense. Is that why you live so far from town? She asked, accepting his help to mount Penny. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. One of many reasons. They rode out of Blackwater Creek as the last light faded from the sky. Eleanor looked back once at the town's flickering lights, then turned her gaze forward to the vast, star-filled darkness ahead. The night trail was challenging for Eleanor, unused to long rides and the rugged terrain. Ryder set a careful pace, occasionally glancing back to ensure she was managing. When they stopped to rest the horses by a small stream, Eleanor eased herself from the saddle, wincing at the stiffness in her legs. We've got another few hours, Ryder said, offering her a canteen. Normally, I'd make camp, but I'd rather get you settled at my place before I report to Pike's ranch tomorrow. Eleanor took a grateful sip of water. What exactly will you be doing for him? Building a barn, breaking horses, whatever he demands. Ryder's voice was matter of fact. Pike's been buying up land, trying to create the biggest cattle operation in the territory. Needs hands to do the work. And how long will it take to pay off my brother's debt? Ryder shrugged. Pike charges high interest, 6 months, maybe more. The enormity of his sacrifice struck Eleanor anew. I can't let you do this alone. There must be work I can do as well. There's a settlement about 10 miles from my cabin. They need a teacher. He studied her face in the moonlight. Mrs. Holloway mentioned you taught in St. Louis. Surprise flickered across Eleanor's features. Yes, mathematics primarily, but how will that help with the debt? It won't, he admitted, but it might give you purpose while you're here and a future after. The implication was clear. Once the debt was paid, she would be free to leave. To go home. But as Eleanor looked around at the vast wilderness, the stars brighter than she had ever seen them in St. Louis, she wondered if returning to her old life was what she truly wanted. They remounted and continued through the night, the trail winding up into foothills covered with pine and aspen. Finally, as the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hint of dawn, they crested a rise and Ryder pointed to a small valley below. There it is, he said. Eleanor had expected a crude shack, but the cabin nestled in the valley was solid and well built, with a small corral and shed nearby. A creek bubbled past, and a garden plot, though currently bare in the early spring, showed evidence of careful tending. As they approached, Eleanor could see the cabin was larger than it had first appeared, with a stone chimney and a covered porch. Morning light glinted off a window with actual glass, a luxury in these parts. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. Ryder's expression softened with something like pride. "Took 3 years to build. Been adding to it bit by bit." Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable, with a main room containing a stone fireplace, a wooden table with chairs, and a small bookshelf that surprised Eleanor with its contents, volumes of Shakespeare, Whitman, and several scientific texts. "You read Shakespeare?" she couldn't help asking. A flush crept up his neck. Not much else to do during winter months. 2 doors led off the main room, one to Ryder's bedroom and the other to a small storage room he had been converting to a second bedroom. "It's not finished," he apologized, showing her the room with its rough-hewn bed frame and straw mattress. "I'll bring in some water for washing up. There's a box with linens in the main room." While Ryder tended to the horses, Eleanor made up the bed and washed away the trail dust as best she could. When she emerged, Ryder had started a fire and was brewing coffee. "I've left some jerky and biscuits on the table," he said, moving toward the door. "I need to get to Pike's ranch." "Probably won't be back until dark." Eleanor nodded, suddenly aware of the strangeness of their situation, 2 strangers now bound by debt and circumstance. "Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. I don't know how I'll ever repay your kindness." He paused at the door, hat in hand. "Ryder," he corrected again. "And there's nothing to repay, just be here when I get back." With that, he was gone, leaving Eleanor alone in a cabin in the wilderness, her future as uncertain as the Wyoming sky. The first week established a pattern. Ryder left before sunrise each day, riding the 2 hours to Pike's ranch to work from dawn until dusk. He returned exhausted, hands blistered and shoulders slumped from labor. Eleanor found herself settling into the role of homekeeper, ensuring a hot meal waited upon his return, and tending to the small garden she had begun planting with seeds from his storage. They existed in a careful dance of politeness, 2 strangers sharing a space, connected by an unusual arrangement neither had chosen. Eleanor learned that Ryder was a man of few words but thoughtful actions. He never entered her room, always knocked before entering the cabin after his day's work, and despite his obvious fatigue, always split firewood and carried water before turning in each night. On the 8th day, Eleanor decided to visit the settlement Ryder had mentioned. She saddled Penny with the skills Ryder had patiently taught her and followed his directions to Riverspend, a small community nestled along the North Platte River. Riverspend consisted of about 30 buildings, a church, general store, blacksmith, and scattered homes. Children played in the dusty street, and women hung laundry on lines stretched between cabins. It reminded Eleanor of a smaller, rougher version of her neighborhood in St. Louis, yet there was a vibrancy here that spoke of frontier determination. At the general store, Eleanor introduced herself to the proprietor, a barrel-chested man named Samuel Watts. "Reynolds' place," he repeated when she mentioned where she was staying. "Didn't know Ryder had company. Man keeps to himself most times." "I'm a friend from back east," Eleanor improvised, unwilling to explain the complicated truth. "I understand the settlement might need a teacher." Watts' face brightened. "Do we ever? Got 15 children here with no proper schooling. Been trying to convince the county to send someone for 2 years now." By midday, Eleanor had met with several parents and the town's unofficial council. They offered her the position immediately, with a small salary and the use of the church for classes 3 days a week. "We can't pay much," apologized Mrs. Matthews, the blacksmith's wife, "but the children need learning. Most of their parents can barely read themselves." Eleanor accepted gladly, Teaching would give her purpose and a way to contribute something toward the massive debt Ryder had assumed. Riding back to the cabin, Eleanor felt a sense of optimism she hadn't experienced since arriving in Wyoming. The vast landscape no longer seemed threatening, but rather full of possibility. The mountains rose majestically against the blue sky, and wildflowers dotted the meadows with splashes of color. When Ryder returned that evening, Eleanor had prepared a stew from vegetables and the rabbit he had snared the previous weekend. "I visited Riverspend today," she announced as they ate. "I'm to be their teacher starting next week, 3 days a week, using the church as a schoolhouse." Ryder looked up from his bowl, genuine pleasure crossing his features. "That's good news. The children there have had little opportunity for education." "They're paying me a small wage," Eleanor continued. "It's not much, but I want to contribute it toward the debt." Ryder's expression closed slightly. "That's not necessary. Your brother's debt is my concern now." "But it shouldn't be," Eleanor insisted. "Robert's actions were inexcusable, but the responsibility is still mine. I cannot sit idle while you work yourself to exhaustion." They fell into silence, the crackling fire the only sound in the cabin. Finally, Ryder spoke again. "How is Pike treating his workers?" The abrupt change of subject caught Eleanor off guard. "I wouldn't know. I haven't been back to his ranch. If you hear things in Riverspend, I'd be interested to know." His tone was casual, but something in his eyes suggested the question held more importance than he let on. Before Eleanor could press further, Ryder stood and moved to the bookshelf, selecting a volume. "Thought you might want this for your teaching." He handed her a well-worn copy of Basic Mathematics and Arithmetic. "Thank you," she said, touched by the gesture. "I noticed your collection." "You've read all of these?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Most. Had a schoolmaster in Virginia who believed education was the only true path to freedom. He taught me to read before I was 8. It was the first personal detail he had shared, and Eleanor seized the opportunity. "Virginia. Is that where you're from originally?" The openness in his expression vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "It was a long time ago." He stood and moved toward the door. "I need to check on the horses." Eleanor watched him go, realizing she had inadvertently touched a painful subject. Like many who had come west, Ryder Reynolds carried secrets from a past he preferred to leave behind. The next few weeks settled into a rhythm. Eleanor taught in Riverspend 3 days a week, growing to love the eager children who soaked up knowledge like parched earth absorbing rain. On the days she wasn't teaching, she tended the garden, learned to preserve food from a neighboring farmer's wife who occasionally visited, and slowly transformed Ryder's utilitarian cabin into something more homelike. Small touches appeared: wildflowers in a jar on the table, curtains fashioned from fabric purchased in Riverspend, the organization of his books by subject rather than the haphazard stacking he had maintained. Ryder noticed these changes but made no comment, though Eleanor sometimes caught him looking at the flowers with an unreadable expression. For his part, Ryder returned from Pike's ranch increasingly exhausted. The work was brutal, breaking wild horses, constructing outbuildings, clearing land, but he never complained. Eleanor noticed the new calluses on his hands, the way he winced when lifting his right arm too quickly, the deepening lines around his eyes. One evening in late April, Ryder returned later than usual. Eleanor had been watching anxiously from the porch, relief flooding her when she finally heard hoofbeats approaching. But her relief turned to alarm when she saw him slumped in the saddle, his shirt torn and bloodied. What happened? She cried, hurrying to help him dismount. "Disagreement with one of Pike's men," he muttered, accepting her shoulder for support as they moved toward the cabin. Inside, she helped him to a chair and quickly fetched water and clean cloths. "Take off your shirt," she instructed, her teacher's voice brooking no argument. Ryder complied with a grimace, revealing a muscled torso marred by a gash across his ribs and numerous bruises. Eleanor gasped softly. "It's not as bad as it looks," he assured her, though his clenched jaw suggested otherwise. "This needs stitching," Eleanor said after examining the wound. I'll need needle and thread. Ryder pointed to a box on the shelf. There, used it for leather work, but it'll do. Eleanor sterilized the needle in the fire and threaded it with steady hands. This will hurt, she warned. Not my first stitches, he replied grimly. As Eleanor worked carefully on the wound, she couldn't help noticing the other scars that marked his body, old wounds that told stories of a hard life. What really happened? She asked, focusing on her task to avoid thinking about the warm skin beneath her fingers. Ryder hesitated. Pike's foreman, Blackwell, has been working the men too hard. A young hand collapsed today from exhaustion. When I stepped in, Blackwell took exception. You were defending someone, Eleanor clarified, tying off a stitch. The boy's barely 18, first time away from home. Eleanor finished the stitches and began cleaning the other cuts. You could have been killed. Blackwell's not that good with a knife, Ryder said with a hint of humor. Eleanor's hands stilled. A knife? He pulled a knife on you. It's handled, Ryder said firmly. Won't happen again. Something in his tone made Eleanor look up and meet his eyes. You beat him. It wasn't a question, but Ryder nodded once. Pike won't be happy, but he needs me more than he needs Blackwell. The man's been stealing from him for months. How do you know that? A smile touched the corner of Ryder's mouth. Because I've been watching. Pike may own half the county, but he's careless with his bookkeeping. For the first time, Eleanor wondered if there was more to Ryder's acceptance of her brother's debt than simple altruism. You had reasons to work for Pike beyond helping me, didn't you? Ryder's eyes met hers, something like respect flickering in their blue depths. Let's just say your brother's misfortune aligned with my interests. What interests would those be? Instead of answering, Ryder winced as he shifted, reminding Eleanor of his injuries. She helped him bind the stitched wound with clean bandages, trying to ignore the inappropriate awareness of his proximity. You should rest tomorrow, she said, packing away the medical supplies. Can't afford to, he replied, already behind on the barn raising. The debt will mean nothing if you work yourself to death, Eleanor argued. Ryder's expression softened. I didn't realize you cared, Miss Jones. The teasing note in his voice brought heat to Eleanor's cheeks. I would feel the same concern for any injured person, she said primly. Of course, he agreed, but a smile played at the corners of his mouth. That night, Eleanor lay awake listening to Ryder's movements in the main room. He had refused to take his bed despite her insistence, claiming the chair by the fire would be more comfortable with his injuries. The steady sound of his breathing eventually lulled her towards sleep, but not before she had confronted an uncomfortable truth. Somewhere between gratitude and admiration, Eleanor had begun to care deeply for the quiet cowboy who had sacrificed his freedom for hers. And that realization was as frightening as it was exhilarating. Spring yielded to early summer, and the Wyoming landscape exploded with life. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows, the creek ran full with snowmelt from the mountains, and Eleanor's garden thrived under her careful tending. Despite her protests, Ryder had returned to Pike's ranch the day after his injury, though he admitted to taking lighter duties for a week while he healed. The relationship between them had shifted subtly after that night. A new awareness hung in the air, acknowledged in small gestures rather than words. Ryder began bringing her wildflowers when he returned from work. Eleanor took to leaving notes in his saddlebag observations about her day, quotes from books she thought he might enjoy. They shared longer conversations in the evenings, carefully avoiding personal histories, but finding common ground in discussions about books, nature, and the colorful characters of Riverspend. Eleanor's teaching had become the center of her days away from the cabin. What had begun as basic reading and arithmetic lessons had expanded to include natural sciences, history, and for the older children, literature and advanced mathematics. The parents had noticed the difference in their children and had increased her salary slightly, which she dutifully set aside to contribute to Ryder's debt payments. In Riverspend, Eleanor had made friends with several women, particularly Hannah Lewis, the doctor's wife, who had taken Eleanor under her wing and taught her frontier skills like preserving food and basic medicine. "You've put down roots here quickly," Hannah observed one afternoon as they picked berries together. "Most Eastern women take years to adjust if they ever do." Eleanor considered this. "I suppose I have. There's a freedom here I never experienced in St. Louis." "And does that freedom include a certain solitary cowboy?" Hannah asked with a knowing smile. Heat rushed to Eleanor's cheeks. "Mr. Reynolds and I have a business arrangement, nothing more." Hannah's eyebrow arched skeptically. "Honey, half the women in the territory have set their caps for Ryder Reynolds over the years. None of them got so much as a second glance. Yet here you are, living in his cabin, and suddenly he's seen smiling in town." "We're friends," Eleanor protested weakly. "Friends," Hannah repeated, clearly unconvinced. "Well, friendship is a fine foundation for something more. Just be careful with that man's heart. He's carried burdens few know about." "What do you mean?" Eleanor asked, curiosity piqued. Hannah hesitated. "It's not my story to tell." "But there's a reason he keeps to himself, has that cabin so far from town. The war left scars on many men, but some wounds go deeper than others." The conversation left Eleanor thoughtful as she rode back to the cabin that evening. She knew so little of Ryder's past, only that he had come from Virginia and had somehow made his way west during or after the war. He never spoke of family, and the careful way he sidestepped personal questions suggested painful memories. When she arrived home, she was surprised to find Ryder's horse already in the corral. He rarely returned before sunset, and the sun still hung well above the mountains. Inside, she found him at the table, papers spread before him and a serious expression on his face. He looked up when she entered, his features softening slightly. "You're early," she said, setting down her basket of berries. "Pike gave the men the afternoon off. Some political friend of his is visiting from Cheyenne." Eleanor hung her shawl and moved to examine the papers on the table. "What's all this?" "Land deeds, water rights agreements." Ryder pushed a leather-bound ledger toward her. "And this is Pike's account book. I borrowed it from his office while he was entertaining his guest." Eleanor's eyes widened. "You stole his ledger." "Ryder, if he catches you, he won't," Ryder said confidently. "He's too busy impressing Senator Harlow to notice it's missing. I'll return it tomorrow before he's sober enough to look for it." Eleanor sat down across from him, concern furrowing her brow. "What are you looking for?" Ryder met her gaze steadily. "Evidence of fraud. Pike's been forcing smaller ranchers off their land for years. I believe he's falsifying water rights documents and bribing county officials." "How long have you been investigating him?" "Almost 3 years," Ryder admitted. "Ever since he drove the Wilsons off their place. Tom Wilson was a friend, good man, honest rancher. Pike diverted their water source, then when their cattle started dying, offered to buy them out for 1/10 of what the land was worth." Eleanor's mind raced. "So when you took on my brother's debt?" "It gave me access to Pike's operation, yes." Ryder's expression was unapologetic. "But that doesn't change why I did it. No one deserves to be treated as property." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, absorbing this new information. "What will you do with the evidence if you find it?" "Take it to the federal marshal in Laramie. Pike has the local law in his pocket, but federal charges would stick." Eleanor studied the neat columns of figures in the ledger. Her mathematical mind quickly recognized discrepancies. "These numbers don't add up. He's recording more cattle sales than his herds could possibly produce." Ryder looked impressed. "You see it too? I think he's rustling from ranches across the territory, changing the brands and selling them as his own." They spent the next hour going through the books together, Eleanor's training in mathematics proving invaluable as she identified patterns of fraud that Ryder had suspected but couldn't definitively prove. "With this evidence, you could bring him down," Eleanor said finally, sitting back. "But Ryder, if he discovers what you're doing before you can reach the marshal." The unspoken danger hung between them. Pike was known for his ruthlessness, and he had men like Blackwell who would carry out whatever retribution he deemed appropriate. "I've been careful," Ryder assured her. And I'm close. Another month, maybe less, and I'll have everything I need. Eleanor reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. Promise me you'll be cautious. I couldn't bear it if something happened to you. The simple touch and the emotion in her voice shifted something between them. Ryder turned his hand to clasp hers, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. I've survived worse odds, he said softly. Their eyes held for a long moment, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. Eleanor was acutely aware of his thumb tracing small circles on her wrist, sending currents of warmth up her arm. The moment broke when Ryder's horse nickered loudly outside, startling them both. Ryder released her hand and stood, gathering the papers quickly. I should check on him, he said, his voice rougher than usual. Probably just smelled the mountain lion that's been prowling around. Eleanor nodded, trying to steady her racing heart. I'll start dinner. As Ryder went outside, Eleanor pressed her hands to her flushed cheeks. Hannah's words echoed in her mind, be careful with that man's heart. But Eleanor was beginning to worry about her own heart just as much. The following weeks brought increasing tension. Ryder continued gathering evidence against Pike, taking calculated risks that left Eleanor anxious each day until he returned safely to the cabin. Meanwhile, their personal relationship hovered in a state of unacknowledged attraction, lingering glances, casual touches that sent electricity through Eleanor's veins, conversations that stretched late into the night. July brought scorching heat to Wyoming. The creek near Ryder's cabin ran lower, and dust devils swirled across the dry landscape. Eleanor's school term had ended for the summer, giving her more time at the cabin, where she found herself watching the trail for Ryder's return with increasing anticipation each day. One sweltering afternoon, Eleanor was washing clothes in the creek when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Expecting Ryder, she looked up with a smile that quickly faded when she saw a stranger riding toward the cabin. She straightened, pushing damp hair from her face as the rider approached. He was a tall man with a neat mustache and expensive clothes that marked him as someone of means unusual in this remote area. "Good afternoon, madam," he called, tipping his hat politely. "I'm looking for Ryder Reynolds." Eleanor dried her hands on her apron, studying the stranger warily. "He's not here at present. I'm Eleanor Jones. May I ask who's calling?" The man dismounted with the easy grace of an experienced horseman. "Federal Marshal James Cooper, madam." He produced a badge from his vest pocket. "Mr. Reynolds sent word that he had information for me regarding Bradford Pike." Relief washed over Eleanor. "Yes, of course. Ryder mentioned he'd contacted you. He's working at Pike's ranch today but should return by sunset. Would you care to wait inside? It's cooler than standing in this heat." Marshal Cooper accepted gratefully, following Eleanor to the cabin. Inside, she offered him coffee and the last of the morning's cornbread, which he accepted with appreciation. "Mr. Reynolds indicated the situation was urgent," Cooper said after they were seated. "Said he had evidence of widespread fraud and possibly worse." Eleanor nodded. "He's been gathering documentation for weeks. Pike has been forcing smaller ranchers off their land, falsifying water rights documents, possibly even rustling cattle." Cooper's expression darkened. "Pike's name has come up before, but no one's been willing to testify against him. He has too much influence locally. Ryder has account books, land deeds with altered boundaries." "Eleanor," Ryder's voice called from outside, hours earlier than expected. She rushed to the door, alarmed by the urgency in his tone. Ryder was dismounting quickly, his expression grim. "Pike knows," he said without preamble. "Someone tipped him off about the missing ledger. He's gathering his men." He stopped short when he saw Marshal Cooper rising from the table. "Marshal Cooper," Ryder acknowledged, tension visible in his shoulders. "You made good time." "Your message suggested it was necessary," Cooper replied. "Miss Jones was just telling me about the evidence you've collected." Ryder moved quickly to the fireplace, kneeling to pry up a loose floorboard. He extracted a package wrapped in oilskin. It's all here, the original land deeds, copies of the falsified ones, pages from Pike's ledger showing the discrepancies in cattle counts. Cooper accepted the package, examining the contents with a practiced eye. This is excellent work, Reynolds. Methodical. There's more, Ryder continued, his voice tense. Pike's been working with Senator Harlow to manipulate land sales before the railroad comes through. They're buying up parcels along the proposed route using proxies, then planning to sell to the railroad company at inflated prices. Cooper whistled softly. That's federal corruption. With this evidence, I can get warrants immediately. There's no time, Ryder insisted. Pike knows I've been investigating him. He's already called in his men. They'll be coming here next. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. Here, Ryder, we have to leave. We will, Ryder assured her, moving to collect essentials. Marshal, can you get Eleanor safely to Laramie while I lead Pike's men away from here? Absolutely not, Eleanor protested. I'm not leaving you to face them alone, Cooper intervened. Nobody's splitting up. You've both witnessed Pike's operations, which makes you both valuable witnesses and potential targets. We'll all ride for Laramie together. Ryder hesitated, clearly torn between protecting Eleanor and ensuring the evidence reached safety. Finally, he nodded. We'll need to move quickly. Pack only what you can carry, Eleanor. Eleanor rushed to her room, grabbing her carpetbag and stuffing it with essentials: a change of clothes, her mother's locket, the small pouch of savings from her teaching. When she returned to the main room, Ryder was loading his rifle and checking his revolver. Ready? He asked, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. She nodded. Ready. They left the cabin minutes later, Ryder pausing only to release the chickens and leave the corral gate open so the horses could reach water. Eleanor felt a pang watching him lock the cabin door in the months she had lived there. It had become more of a home than she had ever expected. They rode hard toward Laramie, taking back trails that Ryder knew would be difficult to follow. Marshal Cooper rode ahead, his experienced eye scanning for signs of pursuit. Eleanor kept Penny close behind Ryder's black gelding, her mind racing with fears and uncertainties. As dusk fell, they made camp in a secluded grove of aspens, far from any established trail. They built no fire, eating cold rations and speaking in hushed tones. We should reach Laramie by tomorrow afternoon, Cooper informed them, studying his map by moonlight. I have deputies there who can provide protection while we prepare the case. Eleanor sat beside Ryder on a fallen log, close enough to feel the warmth of his body in the cooling night air. What will happen when we reach Laramie? She asked quietly. Ryder's expression was somber in the dim light. Cooper will file charges, there will be arrests, a trial eventually. And after that, what then? The question hung between them, laden with unspoken meaning. What would happen to them once this danger had passed, once the debt was settled and Pike was no longer a threat? Ryder's hand found hers in the darkness. I don't know, he admitted. I never planned that far ahead. Eleanor's fingers tightened around his. I can't go back to St. Louis, not now, back to teaching in Riversbend then. His voice held a careful neutrality that couldn't quite mask the question beneath. Eleanor turned to face him, gathering courage. That depends. On what? On whether there would still be a place for me at a certain cabin, even without a debt to be paid. In the silvery moonlight filtering through the aspens, Eleanor watched emotions play across Ryder's face: surprise, hope, and something deeper that made her heart race. Eleanor, he began, his voice husky. The cabins felt more like a home these past months than it ever did before you arrived. Before she could respond, Marshal Cooper approached, expression tense. Movement in the trees to the north, he whispered. Could be nothing, but we should move on. The moment broken, they quickly packed their meager camp and mounted up, riding through the darkness with only the stars to guide them. Eleanor's mind whirled with Ryder's words and the feelings they had stirred. Home. He had called it home when she was there. They rode through the night, stopping only to rest the horses. By dawn, they had reached the outskirts of Laramie, and Eleanor felt a surge of hope at the sight of the bustling frontier town. Surely here, with law on their side, they would find safety. Marshal Cooper led them directly to the federal office, a solid brick building on the main street. Inside, he quickly briefed his deputies, and arrangements were made to house Eleanor and Ryder in rooms above the town's best hotel, with guards posted. "We'll file the formal charges today," Cooper informed them. "Pike and his associates will be arrested by nightfall." In their adjoining hotel rooms, Eleanor finally allowed exhaustion to claim her. She collapsed fully dressed onto the bed, intending only to rest for a moment, but fell into a deep sleep. She woke hours later to knocking at the connecting door. "Eleanor, are you all right?" Ryder's voice called. "Yes, just resting," she replied, sitting up and attempting to smooth her rumpled clothes. "Come in." Ryder entered, freshly washed and changed into clean clothes provided by one of the deputies. The sight of him without trail dust and in a crisp white shirt momentarily stunned Eleanor. He had always been handsome, but the transformation highlighted his strong features and piercing blue eyes. "Cooper's deputies have already arrested Blackwell and 2 other men," he reported. "Pike himself wasn't at the ranch, but they're searching for him now." Eleanor nodded, trying to focus on his words rather than the way the shirt stretched across his shoulders. "Do they think he's fled? Possibly. Or he might be in Cheyenne with Senator Harlow." Ryder hesitated. "Cooper says once they've taken our formal statements, we'll need to stay in Laramie until the trial. Could be weeks, maybe months." "I see." Eleanor rose and moved to the window, looking out at the busy street below. "And what about after? What will you do when this is all finished?" Ryder came to stand beside her, close enough that she could smell the soap he had used. "Go home, I suppose. Rebuild what Pike's men might have destroyed." He paused. "Unless I have reason to stay in Laramie." Eleanor turned to face him, gathering her courage. "And what reason might that be?" His eyes held hers steadily. "You know the answer to that, Eleanor." The air between them crackled with tension. Eleanor was acutely aware of his proximity, of the way his gaze dropped briefly to her lips before returning to her eyes. "I think I need to hear you say it," she whispered. Ryder's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch gentle despite the calluses. "I love you," he said simply. "Have since you started putting wildflowers on the table and straightening my books, maybe even before that." Joy bloomed in Eleanor's chest, warming her from within. "I love you too," she confessed. "I tried not to. It seemed impossible, the circumstances, the debt, everything keeping us apart." "None of that matters now," Ryder murmured, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheekbone. "The debt was settled the moment we fled the cabin. You're free, Eleanor. Free to choose your own path." "I already have," she replied, placing her hand over his. "My path is with you, wherever that leads." The first brush of his lips against hers was gentle, questioning. Eleanor responded by sliding her arms around his neck, drawing him closer. The kiss deepened, years of loneliness and months of unspoken desire flowing between them like a current. When they finally parted, breathless, Ryder rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said, the words somewhere between a question and a declaration. "Come home with me when this is over. Help me build something that's ours, not just mine." Eleanor's answer was another kiss, this one filled with promise and certainty. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. "Yes." Their moment of happiness was interrupted by urgent knocking at the hall door. Marshal Cooper entered, his expression grim. "Pike's been spotted in town," he announced without preamble. "With 6 men, they're armed and making no secret of looking for you both." Ryder's arm tightened protectively around Eleanor. "I thought your deputies were guarding the hotel." "They are, but Pike has friends here too. He somehow learned your location." Cooper checked his revolver. "We need to move you somewhere less obvious while my men deal with Pike." They hurriedly gathered their few belongings. Cooper led them down the back stairs of the hotel and through a series of alleyways to a modest home on the outskirts of town. "My sister's place," he explained as they entered. "She's away visiting relatives. No one will think to look for you here." The house was small but comfortable, with homey touches that reminded Eleanor of the way she had transformed Ryder's cabin. They settled in the kitchen while Cooper outlined his plan. "I've sent for reinforcements from Cheyenne," he explained. "They'll arrive by morning. Until then, stay inside, away from windows. I'll post men nearby, but out of sight." After Cooper left, an uneasy silence fell over the house. Eleanor moved about the kitchen, finding tea and putting a kettle on the stove for something to do with her nervous energy. "This isn't how I imagined proposing," Ryder said finally, a wry smile touching his lips. Eleanor returned the smile, grateful for the break in tension. "I don't know. Danger, a dramatic escape, a marshal's intervention, it seems fitting for us, doesn't it?" Ryder laughed, the sound warming the room. "I suppose it does. Nothing about our story has been conventional from the start." As night fell, they kept watch in turns, though neither could truly sleep. The knowledge that Pike and his men were searching for them kept them alert to every sound, every shadow. In the quiet hours before dawn, as they sat together on a small sofa, Eleanor finally asked the question that had lingered since their first meeting. "Why did you really help me that day in Blackwater Creek? The truth, Ryder." He was silent for a long moment, his arm warm around her shoulders. "My mother was sold to settle a debt," he said finally, his voice low. "I was 10 years old. My father had gambled away our farm in Virginia, then borrowed money he couldn't repay. The creditors took her as payment. I never saw her again." Eleanor's heart ached at the pain in his voice. "Oh, Ryder, when I saw Pike treating you like property, something broke in me," he continued. "I couldn't stand by and watch it happen again, not when I had the means to stop it." Eleanor leaned into him, offering comfort with her presence. "And your investigation of Pike, was that related, in a way?" "After the war, I drifted west like many others. Worked ranches, broke horses, saved my money. When I came to Wyoming and saw how men like Pike operated using power and money to crush others, to take what wasn't theirs, it reminded me too much of the men who took my mother." Eleanor lifted her hand to his face, gently turning it toward her. "You're a good man, Ryder Reynolds, better than most." He caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "I've done things I'm not proud of, Eleanor. The war changes a man." "It changes everyone," she agreed. "But we're defined by the choices we make afterward, and yours have been honorable." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of breaking glass. Ryder was on his feet instantly, pulling Eleanor behind him as a flaming bottle crashed through the window. "Fire bomb," he shouted, grabbing a blanket to smother the flames spreading across the wooden floor. Gunshots followed, bullets splintering the window frame. Eleanor ducked behind a cabinet as Ryder retrieved his rifle. "Back door," he commanded, firing through the broken window to provide cover. "Now." They ran through the house as more bottles crashed through windows, flames quickly consuming the dry wooden structure. Outside, the pre-dawn darkness was broken by muzzle flashes as Cooper's men exchanged fire with pikes. Ryder pulled Eleanor toward the stable behind the house. "We need to get out of the crossfire," he said, quickly saddling 2 horses. They mounted and rode hard away from the burning house, keeping to shadows and back streets. Behind them, shouts and gunfire continued, but no pursuit followed immediately. "Where are we going?" Eleanor asked as they cleared the town limits. "There's an old line shack about 5 miles west," Ryder replied. "Used by cattle drivers during roundups. We can shelter there until Cooper finds us." The line shack proved to be little more than a one-room cabin with a small corral, but it offered concealment among a stand of cottonwoods. They unsaddled the horses and led them inside the corral, then entered the shack cautiously. Ryder checked every corner before allowing Eleanor to enter fully. "It's secure. No one's been here recently." Eleanor sank onto a rough bench, the events of the night catching up with her. "Do you think Marshal Cooper and his men are all right?" "Cooper's experienced," Ryder assured her, though concern lined his face. "And he was expecting trouble, even if not quite so soon." They settled in to wait, Ryder keeping watch at the single window while Eleanor tried to rest. As dawn broke, painting the eastern sky with pale light, hoofbeats approached the shack. Ryder positioned himself by the door, rifle ready. "Who's there?" he called. "Reynolds, it's Cooper." Ryder cracked the door, confirming the marshal's identity before opening it fully. Cooper entered alone, his clothes smoke-stained and a bandage wrapped around his forearm. "Pike?" Ryder asked immediately. "Dead," Cooper replied flatly. "Refused to surrender. 2 of his men as well, the rest are in custody." Eleanor felt a complex mixture of relief and sadness. No matter Pike's crimes, death seemed a harsh justice. "What happens now?" she asked. "We still need your testimony against his operation and Senator Harlow," Cooper explained. "The surviving men will stand trial. With the evidence you provided and your statements, they'll face substantial prison time." He paused, studying them both. "You can return to Laramie now, it's safe." The journey back to town was somber. The reality of lives lost, however deserved, weighed heavily on them all. In Laramie, they gave their formal statements to federal officials who had arrived from Cheyenne, detailing Pike's operations and the corruption they had uncovered. When it was done, Cooper informed them they were free to go, though they might be called to testify when the cases went to trial. "What about Pike's ranch?" Ryder asked. "And the smaller ranchers he forced out?" "The courts will sort through the legitimate and fraudulent claims," Cooper assured him. "Those who were wrongfully dispossessed will have the opportunity to reclaim their land." That evening, as they sat in a new hotel room, the previous one having been damaged in the firefight, Eleanor and Ryder began planning their future. "The cabin may not be standing," Ryder warned. "Pike's men had time to find it before they came after us in Laramie." Eleanor took his hand. "Then we'll rebuild, together." Ryder's eyes softened as he gazed at her. "Are you certain that's what you want? A life in the wilderness, miles from town? You've thrived teaching in Riversbend. I wouldn't want to take you away from that." "I can still teach," Eleanor pointed out. "The settlement is growing. Maybe someday they'll build a proper schoolhouse," she smiled. "Besides, the wilderness doesn't seem so wild when you're there." 3 days later, they were married in Laramie's small church with Marshal Cooper and his sister as witnesses. The ceremony was simple, but as Eleanor spoke her vows, looking into Ryder's blue eyes, she felt a completeness she had never known before. They left Laramie the following morning, riding toward the mountains and the cabin they hoped still stood. The journey took them through Riversbend, where news of their marriage and Pike's downfall had already spread. The townspeople greeted them with congratulations and an impromptu celebration at the general store. Hannah Lewis embraced Eleanor warmly. "I knew it," she whispered triumphantly. "Just friends, indeed." The school council approached Eleanor with an offer of a permanent teaching position and plans for a proper schoolhouse to be built by winter. "We can build closer to town," Ryder offered when they were alone. "Make your commute easier." Eleanor shook her head. "I love our cabin in the valley. The ride to Riversbend isn't so far." As they approached the final ridge before Ryder's property, both held their breath, uncertain what they would find. When they crested the rise, Eleanor gasped. The cabin stood untouched, bathed in late afternoon sunlight. The garden had grown wild in their absence, but otherwise, everything appeared just as they had left it. "They never found it," Ryder said in amazement. Eleanor squeezed his hand. "Or perhaps they weren't as loyal to Pike as he believed." They rode down to the cabin that was now their home. Inside, everything remained exactly as they had left it, Eleanor's curtains still hanging at the windows, wildflowers dried in their jar on the table, books neatly arranged on the shelf. Ryder built a fire while Eleanor prepared a simple meal from supplies they had purchased in Riversbend. As twilight descended over the valley, they sat together on the porch, watching stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. "Hard to believe it's over," Ryder said, his arm around Eleanor's shoulders. "Pike gone, the debt settled, no more looking over our shoulders." Eleanor leaned against him, contentment washing through her. "Not over," she corrected gently. "Just beginning," he smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You're right, Mrs. Reynolds, just beginning." 3 months later, as winter settled over Wyoming, bringing snow and bitter winds, the cabin in the valley stood warm and secure. Ryder had added a second room, expanded the stable, and built a proper root cellar to store the harvest from Eleanor's garden. Eleanor taught 5 days a week now in the newly constructed schoolhouse in Riverspend, riding Penny there and back with confidence born of practice. News had reached them that Senator Harlow had resigned in disgrace rather than face trial, while Pike's surviving men had received lengthy prison sentences. The smaller ranchers who had been forced from their land were gradually returning, reclaiming their properties with the help of the courts. On a crisp December evening, as snow fell softly outside, Ryder and Eleanor sat before the fire, discussing plans to expand their holdings in the spring. "We could raise horses," Ryder suggested. "I've always had a way with them, and there's good money in supplying army remounts." Eleanor nodded, but her expression held something secretive. "That sounds perfect. We'll need the extra income soon." Ryder looked at her quizzically. "Planning some extravagance I should know about." Eleanor took his hand and placed it gently against her abdomen. "Not extravagance, necessity." "We'll need a cradle by summer." Ryder's expression transformed from confusion to wonder. "A baby, you're certain?" Eleanor nodded, joy illuminating her features. "Hannah confirmed it yesterday. Our child will be born in June." Ryder gathered her into his arms, his face buried in her hair to hide the tears that sprang to his eyes. "I never thought I'd have this," he confessed. "A home, a wife, a child, after everything." "Life has a way of surprising us," Eleanor said softly. "Sometimes with debts and dangers we never expected, and sometimes with blessings we never deserved," Ryder finished, drawing back to look into her eyes. "I love you, Eleanor Reynolds." "And I love you," she replied, "my cowboy who paid with his hands and won with his heart." Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the valley in pristine white. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled, casting golden light over the man and woman who had found each other through an unlikely debt, a debt now transformed into the richest of blessings. A love that would endure through all the seasons of their lives together in the wild Wyoming Territory. As spring returned to the valley in 1879, the Reynolds cabin saw new life in more ways than one. Eleanor and Ryder welcomed their daughter, Sarah Grace, on a perfect June morning with Hannah Lewis serving as midwife. The baby had Ryder's blue eyes and Eleanor's determined spirit, evident from her first lusty cry. Ryder's horse breeding operation flourished, his reputation for quality stock spreading throughout the territory. Eleanor continued teaching, bringing baby Sarah along in a special cradle Ryder had built that attached to her saddle. The children of Riverspend adored their teacher's daughter, and many lessons were conducted with Sarah gurgling happily in the corner of the schoolroom. Their cabin expanded again to accommodate their growing family and prosperity. What had once been a solitary cowboy's refuge had transformed into a proper ranch house, with a wide porch where Eleanor often sat in the evenings, grading papers while watching Ryder work with the horses in the corral. On their first wedding anniversary, as they stood together on that porch watching the sunset paint the valley in gold, Ryder pulled a small package from his pocket. "I've been saving this," he said, handing it to Eleanor. Inside, she found a delicate silver locket. When opened, it contained a tiny portrait of their family, Ryder, Eleanor, and baby Sarah, painted by an artist who had passed through Riverspend. "It's beautiful," Eleanor whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Ryder fastened it around her neck, his fingers lingering against her skin. "To remind you that what began with a debt became the greatest fortune a man could ask for." Eleanor turned in his arms, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. "I wouldn't change a single moment that led us here," she said. "Not one." And as the stars emerged above the Wyoming wilderness, the cabin glowed with lamplight, sheltering a family that had found their way to each other through the most unlikely of circumstances: a brother's debt, a cowboy's honor, and a love strong enough to overcome every obstacle the frontier could place in its path.